Hey guys, I just wanted to let you know that this interview's audio quality is not the best. My headphones decided to quit on me right before this interview. So unfortunately, when I'm speaking, the audio quality is not the greatest, but fortunately, when Greg is speaking, the audio quality clears up a lot. So I just wanted to give you guys a heads up. There's lots of great info in this interview. Enjoy it. Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. Today I'm pumped to talk about a topic I'm super interested in with Greg Potter. Greg is currently finishing up his PhD at the University of Leeds in the UK. His research focus is on chronobiology, looking at circadian rhythms, light-dark cycles, and the potential for meals to entrain peripheral circadian clocks. Welcome, Greg.
Hi, Marcus.
Thanks for coming on, man. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you give folks a little bit of background on yourself and sort of what initially drew you into studying all this stuff?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief, but I came to this in a relatively circuitous way. So I became interested in health originally when I was 11. I hurt my back playing rugby, and then that coincided with the time of life when girls start looking attractive to you. So I thought, well, I'll try and look better, get myself down to the gym, start eating better. So vanity pushed me in that direction. And then that really spawned an interest more broadly in health and performance. So I actually had a place at university to study English. And then during a year off, I realised that wasn't the right path for me. Ended up doing exercise science. And during that time, I did an internship and did an exercise physiology pathway. And then I worked in sports medicine for a bit, helping the doctor of the England rugby team with various things related to concussion primarily. And then went back to university, did a master's in exercise physiology, also at Loughborough University in the UK. And then around that time, I became interested in sleep. And it was mostly just through reading and listening to podcasts. And then I saw an opportunity at the University of Leeds and thought, yeah, I fancy something different. And also I recognised that nutrition is important, exercise is important. And the part that I felt that I was missing was sleep. I didn't have a strong understanding of sleep and circadian rhythms. So with that in mind, I thought I'll try and fill that void by studying it for my PhD. And here I am at the University of Leeds now, near the end of it. The finish line is in sight, fortunately.
That's awesome, man. And now you know a ton about sleep. So first off, can you touch on the different sorts of rhythms that are present in the body? So most folks have probably heard of the circadian rhythm, but there are a few others worth noting, right?
Yeah, so you can classify these in different categories. You have ultradian rhythms, which recur at a frequency of at least once every 20 hours or so. So an example of this would just be your heartbeat. You have circadian rhythms, which are roughly 20 to 30 hours. An example of that is your sleep-wake rhythm or your body temperature rhythm. And you have infradian rhythms, which recur every 30 hours or longer. So those can be classified into different categories. You have circadian rhythms, which happen about every 30 days or so. You have circulunar rhythms, which happen about 30 days or so in keeping with the moon. And then you have circadian rhythms, which occur roughly every 12 and a half hours. And you also have circannual rhythms, which happen about every 365 days. But those that are most relevant to us as humans are ultradian rhythms and circadian rhythms, because whereas some organisms have these clear seasonal patterns of behavior, for example, or circulunar patterns or circadian patterns, the presence of those in humans isn't so well established. And I suppose what's important for people to realise is that these rhythms are self-sustained and they evolved in response to these predictable changes in our environments, which are dictated by the rotation of the Earth about its axis, the rotation of the Moon about the Earth, and the rotation of our planets around the Sun too. The idea being that in order for us to thrive in these environments, we need to be able to anticipate and adapt to these predictable changes that happen every 24 hours or so. So change in food availability, predation risk, the light-dark cycle, and so on. And what you find is that organisms whose physiology and behaviour more closely aligns with these patterns in the environment are more likely to pass on their genes. So in this way, it's a fitness characteristic.
Right, that's an awesome breakdown, man. And so you mentioned that the most relative rhythms to us are ultradian and circadian. So can we actually alter our ultradian rhythm? And if so, how can we?
Yeah, so you have probably quite a few of these, but they're not so well studied. And part of the reason is that they're quite difficult to study. So circadian rhythms also are inherently problematic, but ultradian rhythms, you have to do away with things like the circadian rhythms, and that entails some quite difficult statistical analyses. Can you modify them? I'm not sure. And actually, exactly which rhythms we have that are ultradian isn't so clear to me. I haven't spent enough time looking at that research, but I also think that if we're mostly interested in our health, then the thing that we probably should be focusing on related to our body's rhythms is our circadian rhythms.
Okay, cool. So what are the major inputs that affect our circadian rhythm then?
Okay, so for us as humans, the main one is the light-dark cycle. And what's important to understand is that left to our own devices, our body's rhythms aren't necessarily exactly 24 hours. So if you do away with time cues which provide these inputs and tell our bodies what time of day it is, then the period of our internal clocks typically isn't 24 hours, but it's normally slightly longer than that, perhaps 24 hours and 15 minutes or so. So if I took you, Marcus, and we went deep into a cave somewhere and there was no sound, there were no temperature cycles, you had no access to light from outside, and you were just given snacks every hour or so, which are of exactly the same composition, then your body would just adopt its own internal period. So that's the actual length of your internal clock. And with that in mind, our clocks need to be reset each day with the 24-hour day. And for us, the most important time cue is the light-dark cycle. And that process by which our bodies synchronize with the light-dark cycle, with the 24-hour day, is called entrainment. And regarding entrainment, in order for our bodies to synchronize accurately, our body's responses to light need to be dependent on the timing at which we are exposed to light. Okay, so with all of that said, the process by which we actually entrain to the light-dark cycle is mostly related to light coming into our eyes. Light is detected by these specialized cells in our retinae, and they relay information about the light environment directly back to the suprachiasmatic nuclei, which are so-called master clock in our brains. And then that has a multisynaptic pathway to the pineal gland, where melatonin is synthesized. And melatonin is an internal proxy of photoperiod and the scotoperiod. The scotoperiod just being when the sun is down, darkness. So we have melatonin now in our circulation at night because light is no longer coming into our eyes, which shuts down melatonin synthesis, and then that melatonin signal is relayed throughout our bodies to inform our bodies of the time of day. But then, in addition to this light-dark cycle entrainment, we also have other inputs to our circadian system. So whereas the light-dark cycle is the most important time cue for our master clocks in our brains, our peripheral clocks, which are the clocks in our other tissues outside of the brain, outside of the SCN specifically, are mostly responsive to feeding, it seems. We can't say that for sure in humans yet, but there is some preliminary evidence that that's probably the case, and that was published by research at the University of Surrey just last year. So, with that in mind, we have master clock in our brain, and that's very important to synchronizing clocks elsewhere in our bodies through this melatonin pathway. But at the same time, the timing at which we eat and the foods that we eat will influence the timing of clocks elsewhere in our bodies. The key concept here is that each of the tissues in our bodies has its own clocks. Each of the cells in our bodies have their own clocks. And what these do is they just temporarily separate incompatible processes effectively. So sometimes cells want to build things up, sometimes cells want to break things down, and they need something that orchestrates or divides those different processes. And they do this by way of these intrinsic cellular clocks, which are based on clock, gene, transcription, translation, feedback loops that we didn't get into. But with all of that said, key principles are that each day we need to expose ourselves to natural light and minimize our light exposure at night so that we synchronize our master clocks tightly with the 24-hour day, and then also eat at the appropriate times so that all the peripheral clocks in our tissues are kept in appropriate relationships to the master clocks in our brains.
That's an amazing breakdown, man. And when you say that the two most important things, meal timing and first and foremost, light intensity, so how does somebody go about in training their circadian rhythm from an actual light entering the eye standpoint? Like, how would that look? Should somebody go out first thing in the morning and have a walk, or does it matter as far as timing goes? How can somebody do that practically?
Yeah, so practically, most of us synchronize our circadian systems each day without any issues. It doesn't take a great deal of light exposure to actually make sure that our bodies are roughly aligned and have these 24-hour rhythm. With that said, some of us sometimes wish that we could be people who woke up earlier and went to bed earlier, because that would let us get more sleep before we have to wake up to that alarm the next day, which is annoyingly waking us up every morning. Conversely, some people might be very early types and they might want to wake up later. So in those two situations, people would need to adopt different strategies to shift their circadian systems in either direction. And if we take the person who wants to wake up earlier, then that person is going to fare better by exposing themselves to lots of light early in their waking day, preferably light from sunlight, natural light outdoors. The reason being that if you go outside on a clear day, then the amount of light, the intensity of the light you'll be exposed to is typically more than an order of magnitude greater than what you would get indoors. The spectrum is also normally quite different, so you might be exposed to more blue light, and blue light is particularly important in resetting our circadian systems. Our circadian systems are especially responsive to blue light specifically. So you've got someone who wakes up late, they want to wake up earlier, they want to go to bed earlier to give themselves more opportunity to sleep. In those circumstances, someone is better served by getting outside early in the day, but then also at the same time exposing themselves to less light, less intense light, less blue light later in the day. And there are several ways by which you can accomplish that. You can use dimmer switches in your house. You can wear blue blocking glasses, for example. You can make sure that devices that you use, like your phone and your laptop, have apps or settings such that blue light in particular is filtered out, and also that the actual intensity of light that they emit is reduced. So I'm sure you're familiar with apps like Twilight, or if you have an iPhone, maybe you have night shift mode, then you want to use those settings, but also when you're working at night or using those at night, perhaps reduce the brightness settings on those devices. And then if you take someone who is a very early type and they want to start waking up later because they think it's a bit antisocial going to bed at 7 p.m. every night, then in those circumstances you want to expose yourself to more bright light late in the day. And then actually you can do things like wearing sunglasses early in the day, or if you live at a lower latitude, then perhaps you just don't turn on the lights early in the day. The principle being the same, just the inverse of the situation of the person who goes to bed late and wants to wake up earlier. But as I was saying, in most circumstances, people don't have difficulties in training each day to the 24-hour day. There are some exceptions, the main one being people who have dysfunctional photoreceptors in their eyes, which results in something called free running syndrome or non-24-hour sleep-wake rhythm disorder. But that affects a very small minority of people. And in those circumstances, they won't use light to entrain each day. Rather than that, typically melatonin supplementation, which is timed correctly, has been shown to be most effective in helping those people synchronize properly with a 24-hour day.
Okay, cool. So as far as somebody who is, maybe you touched on this, like a quote-unquote night owl or a lark, how much of that is natural or just sort of the way somebody is set up versus our sleep habits? And like, it sounds like it's a movable sort of situation. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. But at the same time, there's definitely a strong genetic component, and you can take extremes of that. So there was a highly cited paper that was published in Science in 2001, which found a mutation in a clock gene in a family. And the result of that was that everybody in that family was an extremely early bird. They were all morning larks to the nth degree. So you have that one situation there. And all of us sit somewhere on the spectrum. The spectrum is a moving target. So at a given age, you'll retain your position relative to your peers, typically, roughly speaking. But people who are at the end of adolescence are going to be at their latest, whereas if you look at a 6-year-old or a 76-year-old, those people are naturally going to wake up earlier and go to bed earlier. So you have this broad spectrum of what are called chronotypes, and you can use mid-sleep time as a simple proxy of chronotype. That doesn't quite get at the concept of chronotype, because chronotype is also about when you actually feel your best, when you function best. And if you're looking at hard physiological markers of chronotype, then typically what you look at is what's called phase angle of entrainment, which is just a fancy way of saying the relationship between the timing of your body's internal clock and the external day. So a good example of that would be the lowest core body temperature that you have each day relative to the timing of dusk. Okay, so in industrialized societies where we have lots of access to artificial lighting, we have some people who go to bed so early that they wake up when other people are going to bed. But in more natural settings, that's rarely the case. And if, for example, you take people and you have them go out into the wild, they don't have access to artificial light anymore, then what you see is the variation between people in chronotypes is reduced substantially during that time.
Gotcha. So, yeah, that was a question that I had for you in a little bit, but we're kind of jumping ahead, so that's awesome. There were some camping studies done, right? There was one done last year, 2017, and then one in 2013. One was in the winter, one was in the summer, I believe.
Yeah, so they all set up in Colorado and the Rocky Mountains. And what they did was they just had people living at home and they tracked their sleep-wake. And then shortly after that, they went into the Rocky Mountains. And during that time, they only had access to natural lighting. And when they were at home, living in their normal environments and using artificial lights as they would do habitually, you had this greater range in the timing of both their body's clocks, but also their sleep-wake patterns. When they went out camping, that timing variability between people was substantially reduced. And they were beautiful studies. They were very well done in that not only did they look at objective measures of sleep timing using these Fitbit-like devices, which are built for research purposes, they're more accurate than Fitbits, but they also looked at actual objective markers of circadian phase, namely dim light melatonin onset. So that is typically about 25% of your body's maximal production of melatonin each night, so the time at which that occurs. And people use that as a marker of circadian phase or circadian timing, the timing of your body's clock, because it's not very responsive to many inputs other than light. So core body temperature, for example, it can be influenced by all sorts of things. Take a walk, your core body temperature goes up. You take some stimulants, body temperature goes up. You have a meal, same thing. Melatonin is not like that so much. It will respond to some things. So caffeine, for example, can delay the phase of melatonin somewhat, but it's used typically as a marker of circadian phase for that reason. So that's what Ken Wright did in those studies. And the nice thing was that they also looked across seasons. So they had measurements that were taken in the summer in one of the studies and in the winter in one of the studies. And what they could do as a result of that was look at how variation in the photo period, so how long the sun is up for each day, influences the timing of people's body clocks. And what they found is that during the winter, melatonin secretion, melatonin synthesis duration was extended in accordance with the shorter photo period. So because the sun is up for a shorter period during the day in the winter, the sun suppresses melatonin synthesis for a shorter period of time, and therefore melatonin is produced for a longer period each night. So they showed that very nicely, and that had previously been shown in the laboratory, but it hadn't been shown in natural settings. So based on that, it seems that, like other animals which are seasonal, we have the capacity to assess what's going on outside us and respond with these responses, namely differences in melatonin profiles, that would, in other circumstances, produce seasonal changes in physiology in other organisms. But whether those actually have implications for how we should live our lives as humans is less clear, because some animals, they have these very pronounced changes each year in their bodies. So they'll go through periods where they fatten up greatly and they're fertile for only a short period of time each year. And this is related to melatonin. So various tissues in your body have melatonin receptors, and there's an area of the pituitary gland called the pars tuberalis, which is very dense with melatonin receptors. And that's important in these seasonal responses. And the seasonal responses are affected in various ways. It involves hypothalamic remodeling and changes in the deiodinase enzymes, which influence thyroid function, and therefore things like metabolic rate and fertility. But actually, that's all cool and interesting, but whether that's relevant to us humans right now is not so clear.
Very cool. So I think everybody's sort of had that experience that has gone camping and man, they're just out like a light. They typically go to bed a little earlier, and a lot of that is a result of being outdoors and training that circadian rhythm, getting the light entering their eye and then the sun going down, and just not having a whole lot of blue light, which you alluded to earlier. Now, touching on melatonin and melatonin supplementation, because people tend to take melatonin, but then also have their devices in front of them and have that external stimulus of the blue light coming in, but supplementing with melatonin, so it could potentially be confusing for the body. No, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, my thoughts are, I understand why you'd say it could be confusing. What's important to realise, though, is that with exogenous melatonin that you take in tablets, let's say that you take 0.5 milligram, the amount of circulating melatonin you'll get in response to that is far higher than your body will naturally synthesize. So it will probably mostly override any effects of things like small amounts of blue light exposure from your devices at that time. But it's a nuanced question. I suppose that the point is that whereas light would influence your body's production of melatonin, it probably wouldn't influence how your body breaks down the melatonin which you've just ingested orally. So there are other aspects to this that are also worth mentioning. One is the dose of the melatonin that you take. So if you take a higher dose, then that's going to lengthen the half-life of the melatonin that you take. So melatonin has a very short half-life, the way that it's normally designed. And it's something like 45 minutes or so. And because of that, it doesn't actually closely mimic how your body naturally produces melatonin over the course of the night, because your melatonin levels would normally be raised for several hours at a time. And for that reason, many companies now are looking at developing pharmacological melatonin with kinetics that more closely resemble your body's natural production profiles. So you can get these slow-release formulations. And if you take a larger dose of regular melatonin, then you're going to prolong the half-life, but it's not going to mimic your natural melatonin synthesis so well. So with that in mind, you have now these options like circadian, which is a slow-release formulation. There are several others. There's one called REM Fresh, which is, I don't know if it's available yet, but it's being studied for that purpose. And I think that people who are interested in supplementing melatonin, it's not an issue, but I think a lot of people tend to have this response where if a little bit is good, then more is better. And that's definitely not the case with melatonin. And if I was going to take melatonin myself, then I'd probably take 0.5 milligram. A lot of people might take 5 milligrams or something like that, but there's not a great deal of reason to do so. And actually, somewhat counterintuitively, sometimes your body's responses to smaller amounts of melatonin are more favourable than those to larger amounts. So if you look at entrainment, for example, let's say that you were flying to a different time zone, then interestingly, taking 0.5 milligram melatonin would better help you adjust your body's clock to the new time zone than taking 5 milligrams, 10 times the dose would. So there are a few ideas that I've just thrown in the mix there, but I suppose that principally, if you're taking melatonin in a supplemental form, then that's probably mostly going to override your body's natural production. You probably don't have many concerns in the long term because there isn't the same negative feedback mechanism that you see with use of some other hormones. So let's say that you took testosterone, for example. After a while, your body would stop producing so much of its own testosterone. It actually happens quite quickly. With melatonin, that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. And for that reason, you don't really see a withdrawal or dependence or anything like that. So I think that it's a very safe drug to take, but take it in small amounts and, yeah, recognize that, again, more is not necessarily better.
That's awesome. Thanks for clearing that up, and super important too, because I mean, you see some tablets of melatonin in the stores, like you said, 5 milligrams, 8 milligrams, even up to 10 milligrams. And if you would recommend taking zero point 0.5 milligrams and you actually get a better effect out of that, that's awesome. Like, and a really important concept as far as just because some is good, more isn't better, right?
Yeah, point 0.3 to zero point 0.5. And if we were speaking about an optimal formulation, then you probably actually want a mix of fast and slow. So let's say you were taking it because you felt that it helped your sleep, then the regular fast-release melatonin would help in as much as it would reduce sleep onset latency, so the amount of time that takes place between when you're first trying to fall asleep and when you actually fall asleep. But the slow-release melatonin would help consolidate your sleep. It would reduce the likelihood of you waking up during the night. So that mixed formulation is quite attractive, and there are a few companies now that are trying to do that.
Very cool. So moving on to nutrition, how does meal timing fit into all this stuff as far as their circadian rhythm goes? Are we better off eating when the sun's up and then tapering off when the sun goes down? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'll start by mentioning a study that I touched on earlier but glossed over. And that was the study that was published by the University of Surrey. And what they did was they took people, healthy people, relatively average chronotypes by UK standards, and just to go back to something that I should have said earlier, which I didn't say, a late chronotype in India might be a relatively early chronotype in the UK. So culture and people's daily lifestyle patterns has a huge influence on this too. That's probably not so much genetically driven. That's just how our environments are built. Okay, that aside, back to the meal timing question. So the University of Surrey researchers, they took people and exposed them to two conditions. So in one condition, they had their first meal about half an hour after waking up, and the other condition, they had their first meal about 5 hours after waking up. Might have been 5.5. And then after that, the subsequent meals took place the same amount of time after the first meal. So effectively, in one condition, their meals each day were shifted about 5 hours later. And at the end of each of the phases, they looked at the timing of their body's internal clocks, but at different levels. So they looked at the master clock, and the way they looked at the timing of that was looking at their melatonin rhythms. Interestingly, melatonin rhythms weren't changed by either meal condition, which you wouldn't expect because melatonin is primarily responsive to the light-dark cycle, right? Okay, but they also looked at other physiological rhythms. So they looked at blood glucose, and they looked at insulin, and then they also looked at expression of these clock genes that I mentioned earlier, both in red blood cells and also in fat cells taken from the buttocks. And what they found is that blood glucose rhythms were delayed by several hours by the later meal timing condition. Insulin tended to be delayed, but researchers have to be careful because when you measure lots of things, you have to account for the fact that the more things that you measure, the more likely that it is that you're going to get a false positive finding. So if you just look at 100 associations in a study, then you're going to get all these spurious findings. And because of that, you adjust for that statistically by using more stringent cutoffs in your statistics. And because they looked at several different outcomes in the study, they used very stringent cutoffs. And for that reason, the insulin results weren't quite significant, but actually the insulin profiles probably were delayed by several hours by the later meal timing condition. Clock gene expression profiles weren't different in red blood cells, but they were different, or one of them was different, in the adipocytes. I think it might have been the period 2 gene expression profile. And just to speak to that quickly, these clock genes, what they do is they form these loops. The important point to understand is that genes are transcribed and then translated into proteins. And clock genes produce oscillating levels of these clock gene proteins. And the clock gene proteins then bind to what are called promoter regions in other genes, and then they regulate the transcription of those other genes. So because you've got these predictable changes in clock gene protein levels over the course of the day, that's going to influence the timing of all of these other genes, which are called clock control genes in the cell. So that's the cellular basis from which actual changes in physiological timing emerges, if that makes sense. So that's a significant finding. So summing it up, what they found is that meal timing seems to influence these clock gene expression time patterns, but then also changes in blood glucose, possibly insulin too, but not in the master clock. What's interesting though is that the later meal pattern didn't have higher blood glucose on average, which you might have expected, because for various reasons our bodies seem to be primed to better take up, to better digest and dispose of nutrients early in our waking days. But they didn't find that in this instance, and that actually contrasts some other research which has been published, because the key concept with all of this stuff is that generally our bodies are better suited to eating and being physically active during the day. So if you look at body temperature, for example, it's higher during the day, so our metabolic rates are higher. If you look at how much our metabolisms increase in response to eating, the degree to which they increase is greater earlier in the day. So that again suggests that if we eat earlier, then that should have favourable effects on how much we weigh, because we're just burning more energy from a given amount of food that we eat. And then because our body temperatures are higher, things like how effectively our muscles work is also high, because certain enzymes in the body work better at higher temperatures. The speed at which impulses travel down our nerves is faster at higher temperatures. So we can produce more force. You could lift more weight in a deadlift or whatever it might be, Marcus, if you went to the gym when your body temperature is higher than at 3 a.m. when your body temperature is probably near its lowest point. So, big picture, during the day, we're better suited to eat, and the time at which we eat definitely seems to shift the timing of some of our rhythms, but it doesn't change the timing of the master clocks in our brains, seemingly. And a key question is whether divergence between the timing of the master clock in the brain and the timing of clocks in our peripheral tissues is problematic or not. And in the long term, I don't think that we can say either way at the moment. Various experiments using other animals suggest that that probably is the case, but right now there just aren't many human studies that have looked directly at that.
That's so interesting. So super exciting stuff to come then on that front. And knowing that, how do you see this playing out in a practical sense? Because from a societal standpoint, we tend to typically like to snack at night while we're watching Netflix or something like that. Like, people typically aren't going to have the urge to munch on chips and cookies as much during the daytime as opposed to while they're lounging on the couch. So how do you see that playing out in a everyday sense?
Yeah, so I think you have to try and set yourself up for success. And actually that largely comes down to your food environment. So it's whether you have the cookies there to eat. If you don't have them there, you're probably not going to eat them. Although that's less the case now, surely, than it once was with the Uber Eats of the world and food availability at the dial of the phone. But practically speaking, with that in mind, you're going to try and do away with foods that you perceive to be less healthy. And when you do feel the need to snack at what's probably a suboptimal time, so let's say that you're ravenous for whatever reason at 10 p.m. and you just think, I'm not going to be able to fall asleep because my stomach's growling that much, then in that particular instance, you're probably better served reaching for something which is going to be higher in protein and perhaps fiber than something which is largely carbohydrate and fat, for example. So that's simplistic, but a lot of it does come down to those simple behaviours. And then there are other things that you can do too. So if, for example, you eat higher quality foods earlier in the day, then you're probably less likely to indulge in those other foods later at night. So strategies as simple as having high protein breakfast, high fiber breakfast, they tend to reduce subsequent food intake later in the day. And it's also probably a virtuous cycle. So if you're eating better during the day and you're avoiding things which are likely to disrupt your circadian system and sleep late at night, like eating too late or having stimulants too late in the day, then you're going to sleep better. And there's a vast, massive evidence showing that when you disrupt sleep, you disrupt appetite regulation and decision-making around food. And it's for various reasons. So you have physiological reasons, you have change in patterns of brain activity, and then you just have simple facts like if you sleep for less time, you're awake longer each day, and that gives you more time in which to eat, so you're more likely to overeat, assuming that you end up burning a similar amount of energy each day, which people seem to tend to do.
That's awesome, man. And I love that you touched on food environment, because I feel like that's the lowest hanging fruit in most instances. And then also just setting yourself up for success. So if somebody is typically not super hungry in the morning, if you are going to eat, make it protein, high fiber, and that sort of stuff. But at the same time, don't force down breakfast and then eat a big lunch when you're not really wanting it, and then have a small dinner when you're most hungry, because you're going to go to bed at 10 o'clock and you're going to impact your sleep. It's sort of like the snowball effect there. So I love that you touched on that.
Yeah, and one thing to throw in the mix too, a lot of people who aren't hungry early in the day are not hungry because they've woken up to an alarm. And it's still actually their body's biological nighttime. So eating at that time is ill-advised. And they shouldn't force themselves to eat when they're not hungry. And actually, this hasn't been looked at yet, but it's quite possibly the case that for those people, they still have things like melatonin in their bloodstream, which probably interfere with the metabolism of some nutrients. So we haven't touched on this, but melatonin seems, although there's a lot of conflicting evidence in this area, it seems to inhibit glucose-stimulated insulin secretion, which means that for a given amount of carbohydrate that you eat, your body is less able to effectively store that carbohydrate where you'd want to store it. And if you still have lots of circulating melatonin early in the morning because you've woken prematurely from sleep, then force feeding yourself at breakfast while you still have all of this melatonin going through you is likely a bad idea.
Great. Okay, cool. So you touched on this a little bit, but how about caffeine intake? So how do stimulants affect our body clock, and how can we manage our stimulant or coffee intake to set ourselves up for success?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and it's something that hasn't actually been addressed as thoroughly as you might expect it to have been addressed. So, I'm going to try and do this right. In circadian biology, there's a key concept which is called the phase response curve. And I alluded to this earlier but didn't directly address it. The idea is that your body's clock responds differently to a given time cue depending on the time at which it's administered. So if we go back to our example of early birds and night owls and how they synchronize the light-dark cycle, the early bird who wants to go to bed later and wake up later, and the night owl wants to go to bed earlier and wake up earlier. In order for that to happen, the body's response to light has to be different according to the time at which the light exposure occurs. So more light early in the day equals a faster clock. That speeds up your clock. That means that you go to bed earlier and you wake up earlier. More light late in the day, that slows down the clock. Go to bed later, you wake up later. Now, that's called the phase response curve of light. And for key agents, key chronobiotic agents, a chronobiotic is just something which influences parameters of the circadian system. So for key chronobiotic agents like melatonin, which we spoke about earlier, so melatonin that you just take because you want to overcome jet lag faster or whatever, phase response curves have been established. For caffeine, they haven't. For other stimulants, whatever it might be, ephedrine, modafinil, they haven't been established either. So we don't actually know for sure. Probably the best work that's been done in this area was by, I think the first author was Burke, the 2016 paper in Science Translational Medicine. And what they found is that if you consume caffeine relatively late in your day, then the circadian rhythm in melatonin is delayed. So people go to bed later, go to sleep later, wake up later. And they also looked at what happens if you apply caffeine to cells in vitro, just in a petri dish. And they found that when you do that, the actual period of those clock gene profiles extends. So that's consistent with melatonin being delayed. It suggests that the response to the circadian system to caffeine is probably a delay. But what needs to happen is researchers need to look at what happens if, for example, someone consumes caffeine very early in their day. So could that actually speed up someone's clock? So let's say that I wake up at 6 a.m. tomorrow and I have 2 cups of coffee. Does that mean that I'm going to go to bed later or earlier? Does that mean my melatonin profile will be shifted later or earlier? We don't actually know that at the moment. What we can say is that, let's say that you don't want to change your circadian system timing and you want to sleep well late at night, then avoiding stimulants too late in your day is a very good idea, unequivocally. And not only is stimulant consumption likely to delay your circadian system, but also what's important to recognize is that how well your body processes xenobiotics, so foreign chemicals like caffeine, varies substantially according to the time of day. So someone who consumes caffeine late in the day will metabolize that caffeine far more slowly than they would do when they consume it earlier in the day. That's likely the case. I can't say that with any certainty, but it's certainly true of other organisms that have been studied. So if we come back to some practical advice for someone, then the first thing that I would say is that people do differ hugely in how well they metabolize xenobiotics. So some people are very sensitive to caffeine. It's related to cytochrome enzymes generally. But other people are very, very sensitive. You just have this huge individual variation. If you don't know details of your genetics and you don't have a good handle on caffeine and how it influences you, then I think that limiting yourself to not having any caffeine perhaps in the 10 hours or so before you plan to go to sleep is a good idea. And as I mentioned earlier when discussing melatonin, the more that you have of something, the longer it will stay in your system for. So the half-life of caffeine, on average, is about 6 hours. But if you have 400 milligrams of caffeine from 4 coffees, for example, then it might be substantially more than 6 hours. So for me personally, I think a good rule of thumb is probably no more than a couple of 100 milligrams of caffeine 10 hours or so before I go to bed. And a couple of 100 milligrams of caffeine for me is probably about a pound of body weight. And that's just personal experience. So you have to work out how you respond to things. But certainly avoiding caffeine late in the day is a good idea. And it's also a good idea for another reason, which I haven't touched on, but we'll just mention briefly, and that's that caffeine's an adenosine receptor antagonist. So it binds to adenosine receptors in the brain, and it blocks adenosine from having its effects there. Adenosine is something that accumulates in our bodies over the course of the day. So it accumulates specifically in extracellular fluid. We have ATP in our cells, that's the energy currency of the cells. And over the course of the day, that's broken down first to ADP and then to AMP. And slowly you have this rise in adenosine levels over the course of the day. And that seems to be very important in making us more and more sleepy. To counteract that, our circadian systems produce this increase in wakefulness across the day. So over the course of the day, generally speaking, you have this greater pressure to sleep, but then also this greater drive for wakefulness to counter that pressure. And then around the time at which you normally go to sleep, you see the sudden drop in wakefulness drive. And then you've got all the sleep pressure. Hey presto, you can fall asleep without a problem. Now, if you consume the caffeine, then you block the sleep pressure from doing what it should do. So now you've got this low wakefulness drive, but you don't have as much adenosine binding to its receptors as you would otherwise do, and you can't fall asleep as effectively. The depth of your sleep will be impaired. And also, it seems to be the case that caffeine impairs with subsequent recovery sleep. So if you had caffeine today, for example, and you can only sleep 6 hours tonight, and you need 8 hours, and tomorrow you try and get your 8 hours, your sleep tomorrow will be impaired by the caffeine you had today. So caffeine is a double-edged sword. It's really, really useful when you're tired, you need to be sharp. Let's say that you fly to a different country and you've got a meeting and you want to be switched on, you want to do a really good job with it. At the same time, recognize that that's going to come back and bite you in a way.
That's great advice, man. And yeah, the way I kind of look at caffeine is like, if you're gonna overdo it, you sort of pay now or you pay later, and so you want to be careful with that stuff. And touching on traveling to a different place, when somebody's switching time zones, how can they acclimatize to the environment that they're going to and then again back home as quickly as possible with as far as caffeine goes, and then also dovetailing off the primary thing that impacts the SCN, which is light entering the eye? How can we manage that to the best ability?
Yeah. There are a couple of approaches which you can think about, and they're quite different actually. So in one approach, what you think is, okay, I know that I'm going to be travelling. Let's say that I travel to the States. I fly to New York from England, and people in New York are doing things 6 hours later than they are here. I can think, well, before I go out to New York, I can try and facilitate that accommodation by shifting the timing of my patterns later in the day. Or I can think, well, I'm going to New York, but let's say I'm only going for 3 days. And in those circumstances, if I try to shift my timing later, then perhaps I won't sleep as well during that time. So I'll be heading out to New York, and I'll already have a bit of a sleep there, which is going to interfere with my ability to function while I'm out there. So what I could do is I could try and bank as much sleep as possible now. I could try and create some sort of sleep reserve such that when I go out there, I'll be able to better buffer the effects of sleep loss. Or I can think, well, I'm going to try and shift the timing of my circadian system such that when I go out there, I'm more closely aligned with New York time. And those two, they're not mutually exclusive, but they're not so compatible either. Let's say that we want to shift the timing of our clocks as quickly as possible. We can try and do that here before flying out there or when we're out there, but let's just speak about when we're out there. First, spend time outside and spend lots of time outside. That's by far the most important thing. Second, you might want to consider a fast before you go out there, and then as soon as you're there to start eating on their time. Now, I've gone back and forth over the years with the best way to do this, because on one hand you could think, well, I want to keep synchrony in my circadian system. So let's say that my body clock in my brain, my master clock, can only shift at a rate of about 1 hour a day. That's typically what people say. With that in mind, if you wanted to maintain alignment in your body's different systems, then you'd want to shift your food intake by 1 hour a day too. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But if, on the other hand, you want to try and speed things up, you could just shift your food timing straight away and then wait for the master clock in your brain to catch up. And actually, I tried that the last time I went to the States and felt better that way. And a lot of people swear by doing an extended fast before flying somewhere different, and only when they're in the country beginning to eat on time with the people in that country. So I think you probably experiment there, and I don't think we can say either way is better for sure yet. Other things that you can do are melatonin primarily. That's going to be useful. So with big time zone differences like that, 6 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, whatever it might be, taking melatonin around the time, as a general heuristic, as a rule of thumb, taking melatonin around the time at which you want to fall asleep in the new time zone is probably useful to helping synchronize your circadian system with the new time zone as fast as possible. As I mentioned earlier, about 0.5 milligrams is probably about right. You needn't take more than that for purposes of re-entrainment. Other things, you can take caffeine in the new time zone, but recognize that that's going to improve your performance in the short term, but then also perhaps make you feel worse in the long term. So I would personally use stimulants if I was going somewhere for a short period of time, knowing that I wasn't going to fully synchronize with a new environment and I was going home soon, for example. But in other circumstances, I would be more hesitant to do so. It's definitely very useful if you have something like an important meeting. Various stimulants can be used for that purpose, but otherwise, just recognize that it might interfere with your sleep. And then there are things that you can do generally to help with your sleep when you're there too. So these are adjuncts to melatonin. They act through different mechanisms, but there are various dietary compounds and supplements that you can take which probably do have quite strong effects on sleep. A lot of them aren't so well studied, but the mechanisms are very reasonable. And we won't go into details now, but there are many of them out there. You can look at things like GABA and valerian, lemon balm, magnolia bark. There are lots and lots of different ones. Primarily, they typically target GABAergic neurons in the brain. You can also look at antihistamines too, which can be very useful in helping people fall asleep. And they're normally used for allergies, but actually they make people drowsy when they take them for allergies. And for that reason, if you just want to get a good night's sleep, knowing that you're otherwise not going to get any sleep whatsoever, then taking something like diphenhydramine, the antihistamine, that can be quite useful in that particular instance. But key concepts with entrainment would be spend lots and lots of time outdoors, consider a fast before you go out there, start eating on their time, and melatonin is still the most useful agent in helping people resynchronize their circadian systems.
That's awesome. Super useful stuff there for the folks that travel a fair bit. And then the last major concept that I wanted to touch on was social jet lag. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it's so important for us.
Yeah. So social jet lag just describes the phenomenon that many of us experience probably every week. And it's named that way because for many people, it's as if every Monday rolls around and they work a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday job, and they have to get up at 7 a.m. and they're used to getting up at 8:30 a.m. on the weekends, and now all of a sudden they effectively have to shift everything an hour and a half earlier. So in that way, it's like it would be like flying an hour and a half to the east every Monday and then back home to the west every Friday night. And it affects lots of people. So if we look at Northern Europe, for example, about 69% of people experience at least an hour of social jet lag a week. And why is that important? The main reason probably is that people lose sleep. So if we look at trends in sleep in recent years, it seems like over the last decade or so, people have lost about 37 minutes from Monday to Friday combined each week. And that might not sound like much, but it's very clear from the literature that the consequences of insufficient sleep accumulate over time. And what's interesting there is that people don't necessarily perceive that. So if you take objective measures of people, then you will see decrements in their performance over time. But you might not necessarily hear people report that they feel worse over time. So, social jet lag is pervasive, and there's now more and more evidence coming out that it's problematic too. So, the first large study that looked at this was published in 2012. It was Till Ronenberg's group, and they found that social jet lag was associated with BMI among overweight and obese people. So among people who had BMIs of over 25 and over, the more social jet lag that they had, the higher their BMIs were. So it seems to be involved in weight regulation, which would make sense if people are losing sleep for reasons that I just touched on earlier. But then also it seems to be involved in other habits which aren't conducive to good health. So things like smoking, drinking alcohol. And people now are also looking at it for possible roles in other metabolic issues. So dysglycemia, hypertension, all these different things which now plague modern societies. So that's a very brief overview of social jet lag.
Very cool, man. Yeah, I heard a crazy stat, something like car accidents increase by about 20% when the clocks spring forward, which is just pretty wild to think about, and it makes sense, right?
Yeah, so that's daylight savings time. It's controversial still, and the evidence isn't completely clear, but there was a paper, I think in 1996, by a guy called Cohen in the New England Journal of Medicine that looked at car accidents and found that big spike each year at daylight savings time. And at the same time, what you see, not at the same time, that's exactly the wrong thing to say, but when the clocks change back in the other direction, you see a spike in depressive issues, it seems. So the point is that each year we have these sudden changes in what society demands of us, and it messes people up. And it seems also that you probably see a spike in things like cardiovascular issues at that time too. So heart attack rates, for example, seem to temporarily increase a bit around the time of daylight savings time. And there's a whole untapped area of things to look at here too, because that's an obvious example where, as far as I'm concerned, society has things exactly wrong. But elsewhere in the world, you see things that are more extreme still. So if you look at China, for example, the entire country follows Beijing time. But the country spans 5 different time zones. And that strikes me as being completely ludicrous. But I don't think that people have studied what the implications of that are yet. I certainly haven't seen any papers on it. And it's an area that's ripe for research, and it's going to be really important to try and understand that because so many people live there.
Totally. So as we sort of wrap up here, and being that it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon here for me, but 9 o'clock for you. So what does your sleep routine look like besides podcast chats late at night? How do you set yourself up for good sleep?
Yeah, how do I set myself up for good sleep? I would say that I'm generally quite a good sleeper. In the interests of transparency, 1 or 2 nights a week I'm not a good sleeper, but that's because it's still important to me to have a social life, and I really like electronic music, and for that reason Friday or Saturday night normally rolls around and I get very, very little sleep, and then I do my best to catch up otherwise, and I'm generally quite good at doing so, but quite often my pattern is something like 2 hours of time in bed, and then the next night it will be 11 and a half hours of time in bed, and then 10 and a half, and then 9 and a half, and then by Thursday I'm back in the room and I'm running on all cylinders. Now, with that said, what does my pre-bed routine look like? So I'm quite careful with my lighting environment. All the devices that I have apps that are built into them to filter out blue light when dusk happens. I've also reduced the brightness settings on all of them in order to try and diminish any effects of high intensity light on my scaling system. Fortunately, the flat I live in has relatively dim lighting anyway, so it's actually quite conducive to sleeping well in that way. And I think it's just important to have a routine. So a lot of people set alarms for when they wake up. It can be really useful, though, for people to actually set alarms to go to bed, which seems completely backwards initially, but until you're in the habit of shutting down at a certain time, that can be a very healthy thing to do, I think. So for me, typically, I'll stop working typically about an hour before I go to bed, and then I'll normally pull out a book. I'll dim the lights, keep the lights as low in my bedroom as possible while still letting me read. And I'll also open the window to make sure the bedroom's nice and cool. And then having some white noise in the background also seems to be important. So noise from things like planes and trains and cars routinely disrupts sleep in lots of people. White noise machines can be useful for that purpose. I use a fan, and right now it's March in Leeds, which means that it's pretty cold outside, and I still have my fan on because having that white noise in the background is really important to me, and I like being cool. I definitely sleep better when I am cool, and that's quite well accepted too. So if we go back to melatonin, for example, one of the ways by which melatonin reduces sleep onset latency, the amount of time that it takes you to fall asleep, is by reducing core body temperature. There's certainly an association there, at least. So what you should see is that around the time that you're winding down, your body temperature starts to drop. And this is probably one way in which eating too late is counterproductive to good sleep, because when you eat food, you have the thermic effect of feeding, wherein your body's metabolism has to rev up certain processes in order to digest and assimilate those nutrients. So you see a spike in body temperature, and that's offsetting the natural fall in body temperature that you should have at that time when you're trying to go to sleep. So things that you can do to encourage that fall in body temperature also include things like warm showers, which might sound counterintuitive, but actually when you come out of the shower, what you're doing is you're facilitating heat loss. So you're actually speeding the rate at which you lose heat. And people routinely find that actually that helps them fall asleep faster too. So if I was just going to give a few key principles, it would be have a routine, consider setting an alarm clock for when you go to bed, don't eat too late, do something relaxing. And for some people that can actually be getting rid of and seeing to annoying emails that you just want to get off your desk, because actually you don't want to go to bed knowing that you've got all of the spam to deal with the next day. And for people to get in the right mindset and just relax, they need to get those off their desk. So if that's you, then that's fine. For other people, relaxing might entail something like a board game or reading a book. It's probably not watching a horror film. And then white noise in the background, cool bedroom, avoiding all light sources where possible. So if you have an alarm in your room, then perhaps trying to just put something that covers the lights being emitted by the alarm. If you have a Fitbit, then you can have the Fitbit wake you up, or whatever watch that you wear, which is similar to that. And you could also just use things like eye masks. If you want to look really cool and you want to reduce your exposure to blue light, then you can wear those blue blocking glasses. I haven't tried them. I don't have the self-confidence for that.
Neither do
but
I.
You can get that route. And then, avoiding caffeine too late in the day is also, of course, going to be handy. And there are things that you can take to help you fall asleep faster, but most people shouldn't need those. And if you're spending lots of time outdoors during the day and you're living a generally healthy lifestyle, then you shouldn't really have sleep issues. A couple more things I'll throw in the mix. I'm very, very long-winded, I understand. One is that meditation can be useful. So things to quieten your mind. A lot of us will just lie in bed and you might be excited about the next day, or you might be worried about something, or you might be sad or whatever. But if you have a practice which just generally helps you reduce your stress levels, like meditation, then that can be very useful. And using that as and when it's needed can definitely help shut down your brain at night. And then the last thing that I'll throw in there is that how you live during the day is also very important to getting good sleep too. So physical activity, for example, definitely seems to be important. And if you can do that outside, then you're getting the best of both worlds. You're having the circadian system entrainment, and there are other things too which you haven't spoken about, like vitamin D synthesis in response to UVB radiation, which is going to benefit your health. Light has all sorts of beneficial effects on cognition and so on. You're going to be more productive, you're going to feel better. But then also, by doing that physical activity outside, you're promoting processes in your body that facilitate sleep too.
Wow, so many great tips there, man. Awesome takeaways for folks. And I think that as far as the eating too late in the day one, if you're someone who wakes up with the night sweats, that's sort of a pretty anecdotal input, basically, that you've probably eaten too late. There is a temperature factor there too, but like Greg said, it increases metabolic rate. And then setting a bedtime alarm is just genius, right? Like if you get carried away watching shows and stuff like that, set an alarm and just remind yourself that, hey, it's wind down time. I think that's super, super useful. And Greg, so much awesome info for us today, man. If folks want to learn more about you and where they can find you.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. Don't tweet that frequently, I'm quite busy at the moment, but I'll get on there once a week normally and throw some spam at the people who follow me. That's at GDM Potter. It's G for Greg, D for David, M for Maxwell. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I have a ResearchGate account too, where I put up any research which I've published. I check that pretty infrequently though. But yeah, those are the primary avenues. And I'll throw in a plug too for people that I work with. I work with a company called Human OS. And Marcus, I know you've spoken to Dan Pardy, the CEO, recently. Dan is a truly wonderful human being who I had the great pleasure of spending time with recently. And he knows an awful lot about an awful lot. And he's created something which is really useful in Human OS. And there aren't quick fixes in health. And what's important actually is that we live healthy lifestyle patterns. And Human OS is very useful to that end. But also there's a blog there where we write various articles about things like sleep, but also diet and exercise and so on. And I know you've spoken to Jeff Rothschild and Stefan Guinney. And they have courses up there too to teach people about things like diet and obesity and fasting. So come check us out there. That's humanos.me.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I'm running through everybody on the Human OS team. You guys have a stacked lineup there. And Dan, I've got like a total man crush on that dude. He's like, man, he's got his shit together. He knows a lot. So I'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. And Greg, again, thanks so much for joining us today, man.
Yeah, absolute pleasure.
All right, guys, I'll catch you on the next episode.